We are now ready to start adding navigation to our site. But let's first discuss it because navigation is a big part of ASP.NET Core, especially because of routing that is involved. In ASP MVC application, the requests are handled by the action methods on the controller. So the MVC needs to map each request to the correct action on the correct controller. So how does the application know what action needs to be invoked and on which controller? Well, all that is handled by routing, which comes built in with ASP MVC. If you remember, we did set up a basic routing earlier in the course by registering a service in the startup.cs class. And we did it using use routing endpoints. There are two main types of routing available: convention-based and attribute-based routing. For MVC-based application, convention-based routing is more common, and we will use that one too. Attribute-based routing is more common in APIs. As far as routing goes, each route is a URL pattern that is mapped to a handler, which for MVC application is the action in the controller. The routing means that we do not need to type all possible routes manually. Instead, each URL is compared with the available routing patterns, and the first route that matches the pattern is used to trigger the corresponding action. So for example, we have www.candyshop.com/candy/list. The URL is constructed with several segments, and the first part, which is the www.candyshop.com, is the host. Typically, the first part after the host, in our case candy, points to the controller, and the part after the controller, which is list, it is the action on the controller. Although this pattern is clear to us, it is not by default clear to ASP MVC. We need to somehow set it up first. We need to tell the MVC that when a route with two segments after domain is found, then the first part is the controller and the second part is the action on that controller. And we could add other segments as well. For example, in the second example, we have candy/details/1. Here, the controller is still candy, but the action is now details, and we are also using an ID 1, which would typically mean that we want to display details of a candy with ID 1. And just like before, we need to let the MVC know of this pattern and set up routing for it. So first, we need to enable routing. And we did set up a single route. The route we set up was used as a default route. In fact, we even named it default. So this is the route that was used so far because our page matched the pattern of the route, which is simply controller/action. Most applications will of course have multiple routing patterns. And when multiple routings are used, it is important to have them in correct order. Remember, when the matching pattern is found, it is used and the application does not search for any other pattern. Therefore, we always define our patterns from the most specific to the most generic. Now we can also specify default values for the segments in our routes. So for example, in the controller equals home and action equals index, we specified that if the user does not enter controller or action, we will automatically route to home/index. So we will route to home controller and index action on that controller. So when the user enters only domain URL, just like it is www.candyshop.com, then the route will go to home controller and index action. We could however have values for some of the segments to be optional. Optional values are defined with a question mark, such as the ID and then question mark after that. So when this route is used, then the following would be mapped to it. It would be the candyshop.com, then candyshop.com/candy/details/1, and also candyshop.com/candy/list. All of these match the pattern. The first one is mapped because by default it would go to home controller and index action. And since ID is optional, it simply would be omitted. The second one is mapped because we specify the controller, which is candy, and the action, which is details, and we also pass in the ID of 1. And the third one is mapped because we specify the controller, which is candy, and the action, which is list, and the ID is optional, so we do not need to pass it in order for us to use this route. So for our application, this one route will work great because it will cover displaying lists of products as well as single products based on ID. And it will allow us to go to the home page just by typing the domain URL. And one more thing you may find useful, and that is the use of constraints in the URL. For example, consider an optional parameter ID, but we would require it to be an integer. So we would type ID, column, integer, and then question mark. So here we specify that the ID must be an integer. If we try to pass a non-integer value, the request will not be mapped to this pattern. If we don't pass any ID, the pattern will still be matched because the ID is still marked as optional. Alright, so that's all about routing, but we are not finished just yet because there's one more important thing we need to discuss that goes hand in hand with routing, and that's tag helpers.